Hey, everybody, and welcome to our event today. We're going to be talking about preparing for the next big global cyber event. As everybody knows, when Log4j happened, there was a bit of a freak out, and especially because it sort of trickled out and happened on a Thursday, Friday, and then over the weekend, it really blew into, the event that we now know. I'm lucky enough to work at Critical Insight with folks who you're going to meet today, like Jeremy and Mike. By the way, I made the mistake of calling. I meant to call Jeremy and Mike the Great Jeremy and the Great Mike, but I just said the Great Jeremy. So we're going to call Jeremy today the Great Jeremy, or maybe I'll just do that. Anyway, I'm lucky enough to work with them where Mike and Jeremy said, folks should be prepared for this because it's going to happen over and over. So we decided to put together this event so that you can be ready for the next big event. So we're going to do introductions with the great Jeremy. We're going to do sort of, hey, what's happening, what happened, better Log4j description than I just gave you. We're going to talk about patching and workarounds, and we're going to do some question and answer here. So joining us today is Jeremy Johnson, who runs our adversary replication and detection division. Important to this is that he is part of the Mountain Rescue and was in the Marine Corps in 9/11. So dealing with catastrophe and dealing with disaster is something he is keenly attuned to. Mike Simon is our Chief Technology Officer. He's also a 30-year consultant who has helped large and small and medium organizations through when the blankety blank hits the fan. Since this is going to be on YouTube, I guess I can't curse, or YouTube will make it like adults only or something. Although I don't actually think kids will watch this. And I'm Jake Milstein. I'm the event host. Our recent urgent discussion was about Log4j, and what happened was right after Log4j happened, we did an urgent discussion. 300 people came, got tips, and as far as we know, secured their environments, which is great. And that's what led to the idea for this one. And with that, let me give you Mike Simon and Jeremy Johnson. Mike, go ahead.
Thanks, Jake. And yeah, let's start with a little bit of background on kind of Log4j and really what it implied. And when Jake says we believe it's going to happen again, we'll show actually that it's been happening as well. So mid-December, Log4j hit. It's a remote code execution vulnerability. Which means that some random person on the internet that attacks you can run whatever they want on a system that's vulnerable to this. Some of the more terrifying aspects of this is that infrastructure maybe that you didn't even build, things that are in the cloud. Some of our testing showed that elements of AWS that were completely black box to anybody using them were vulnerable at that moment to Log4j. They fixed it quickly, as you'd hope, but during a short period of time, a piece of infrastructure you may have been using was directly vulnerable to this remote code execution vulnerability. So that code would have executed just as if you'd loaded it and asked to have it run yourself. And it because it was so easy to exploit, public proof of concept code was released almost immediately. So next slide, please. And most of the talking heads that talk about this stuff, especially short term or early in the release of something like this, get it a little bit wrong. In this case, they mostly didn't. Department of Homeland Security were saying it was probably the worst thing that they'd seen yet. I'm not so sure about that. It's pretty awful and extremely damaging potentially. But everybody really was saying, yeah, this is terrible. Next slide, please. So Douglas Adams fans listening to this, watching this, will get this quote. It was thought by I believe, sperm whale as it was plummeting to Earth from orbit. It's going to happen. This kind of thing has happened before. It's going to happen again. What Jeremy and I want to talk about today is this idea that you can prepare for something whose effect you don't understand yet or don't know or can't predict. That there are aspects of what you can do for your organization that will help you no matter what happens next. And some of that's the basics. You know, we're not going to really dive into the basics. We do that in other places, other videos, other times. A lot of this is a little bit philosophical, but it's also about direct actions you can take to make yourself more resilient. Next slide, please. So I said it had happened before. Here's a completely not complete list of things that were, I think, at least similar in nature in some cases in their global effect. You know, Heartbleed, if you were around in IT for it, was kind of terrifying because anybody who used OpenSSL libraries, which is almost everyone who produced a encrypted web style link on the internet, which included VPNs, SSL VPNs, was affected by this. And the effect via essentially a zero code exploit was that you might expose passwords for things like a VPN directly. 2014, MS-17-010, a favorite of Red Teamers still because not everybody has patched it. If you have it and haven't patched it, please do. About a quarter of global shipping shut down because of that for about 2 weeks. One of the major shippers did not react quickly enough, and their services went quiet in 2017 for about 2 weeks. The SolarWinds one, fairly more recent. We actually did an urgent webinar on that. December 2020, and federal agencies seem to have been part of the targeted group, but thousands of other companies actually had Orion and the code injected into SolarWinds pipeline installed. And then, of course, Log4j. I didn't go back any further. It is possible to go back further. You could argue that the Morris worm, one of the first pieces of malware to traverse the globe back in the 80s, was of the same nature. It didn't do a lot of damage, but it did exploit a problem in email, that was exploitable on almost every email system available. Next slide, please. Jeremy, I think this is yours.
Thanks, Mike. So as Jake introduced me, I do have a bit of experience in Olympic Mountain Rescue, 8 years in that. And one of the big trainings that we got is ICS, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But also my time in the Marine Corps overlapped September 11th. And I think especially in the position I was in, and also being in Quantico and in proximity to the Pentagon, there were a lot of disaster related kind of things, which I think gives me a little bit of a unique perspective on this, which again, I'll get into. So regarding the basics of cybersecurity, I think when we first started talking about doing this webinar, we had talked about making sure that you do the basics, things like the top 20, things like inventory, knowing what you have. But I think the reality is that the basics prepare you for the things that you expect, or the things that are known, risks that you can kind of quantify and understand. My argument is that Log4j was not a normal kind of security event, in the sense that it was global, it affected everybody, and in many cases, the basics weren't really going to help you. And I feel like we're beginning to see more of these incidents where things that are kind of outside the realm of what is currently kind of normal are occurring. So Log4j specifically, it was nearly impossible to inventory. Like, that's one of the things that we in cybersecurity often tell our customers and like often advise is know what you have, whether that's hardware or software or people or assets, whatever it is. In this particular case, and just the current state of technology today is it's nearly impossible to have an accurate inventory of everything that you own. There's so many black boxes in our environments that it's difficult to really quantify what exactly is on that device, let alone what version is even running on that device. Which meant that this vulnerability was possibly everywhere or nowhere, or like kind of both, where it may exist in a firewall. You're not sure. The vendor maybe isn't sure for 24 hours or 36 hours if they're delayed in responding. Whether the vulnerability is like actually exploitable even on that device was dependent on how that software was set up, which makes it really difficult to trace the problem. And especially when you start talking about these black boxes or even systems that you've set up, something like Log4j being fairly ubiquitous in the software world, it was, in our experience and in our clients' experience, difficult to trace where that problem might exist, even if you did find it. It was difficult to verify. The scanners were having a hell of a time trying to figure out what was a true positive hit for this vulnerability. So the scanners like Nessus were often returning really low confidence results, either false positives or false negatives or some combination of both. And in order to verify it, it often required you to attempt to exploit it and to do it in a controlled fashion so that you could validate whether or not it was vulnerable, which then leads you down this kind of sketchy road of if you didn't exploit it, or if it didn't exploit or behave in the way that the vulnerable version did, does that mean that you're not vulnerable, or does that mean that you failed to perform the exploit properly? So it like really puts you into this gray area of trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And the consequences of this is, often a system level compromise. Whatever software was running that had this vulnerability, you kind of automatically got the rights and privileges of the service or application that was running this software. So this was like a really big deal, like as we all know, and it was more difficult to respond to than something like making sure everything was updated from Patch Tuesday at Microsoft. This wasn't like a Microsoft vulnerability that was pretty quick and easy to fix. Next slide, please.
Hey, Jeremy, before you move on, I want to point out the title of the department that you head and what you do at the company, because it's relevant to what you were just talking about. You want to go ahead with that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the director of adversary replication and detection. And so I run the red team, and I also have a blue team. So the red team takes these kind of vulnerabilities and attempts to exploit them at our clients on consulting engagements like penetration tests and vulnerability assessments and red team engagements. And then blue team works with the red team to figure out what are the signals that are created when that exploit occurs, when the red team is on premises or like doing their activity, and then how can we roll those learnings into better engagements with our clients, but also improving our own product.
I only want to point it out because not everybody has an AR&D team.
Yeah.
And it makes you uniquely suitable to talk about that issue you were just talking about, how difficult it can be at times to replicate the adversary's behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. So next slide, please. Thanks. So when Log4j came out, my intuition pretty quick was this is the worst vulnerability I've seen in my career in IT, which goes back 20 years. And talking with Mike, whose career goes back 30 plus years, he also agreed this is the worst, which kind of leads me down this path of realizing and thinking about the last decade or so in cybersecurity events and realizing that the trend is getting worse. So it's not that everything is on fire and like everything is terrible. It's that the scale of the compromises are getting bigger. The impact is bigger, and it has a broader impact. So we're seeing things like Mike mentioned in one of the first slides things like SolarWinds, a ubiquitous software installed everywhere, including Microsoft and Fortune 10, Fortune 500, having back doors that allow attackers to have access to these massive organizations for extended periods of time, possibly planting other backdoors. So we've kind of moved away from, like, we're way past the days when it was mostly what we would have called script kiddies, like people running exploit code to like impress their friends. We're way past the days of security researchers performing like little hijinks on the internet to, you know, who knows, gain fame or whatever. We're now at nation state. We're now at people are making money. Like there's real money in the game in this. And it's definitely increasing the impact. So I think the other thing that I've noticed is that these highly competent organizations that have entire teams full of security professionals, entire like processes and policies, like not necessarily doing it perfectly right, but doing it really well, leading the charge, and they're also being compromised. And it's not that they've screwed up, it's that like we have to do, they've placed some level of trust in the partners, organizations that they work with, and the software that they use, and that trust is being exploited at like a much greater level. And then I think also something that's leading to this is this homogenization of our resources, where you're either on AWS or Azure. I know that there's some Google Cloud out there and maybe some other cloud services, but I would hazard the guess that by and large, most people are on AWS, with Azure perhaps second, which means that if there is an outage on AWS, then massive portions of internet resources go down because we've become so dependent on these few resources in the environment. So an impact at one of these, so if we're seeing these vulnerabilities impacting large organizations like AWS, like Amazon, like Microsoft, and we've placed all of our eggs in those baskets, it means that we're also going to be affected by those things. Next slide, please. So I'm not a fan of like doom and gloom and like scaring the crap out of everybody and then like walking away. I don't think that's fair to anybody, and I think it's kind of intellectual laziness. So my question, like my immediate question is like, okay, it's getting worse, but what can we do about this? And where that led me to thinking is about what we would call like a black swan event, the unexpected, the thing that never happens does happen. The thing that you never even thought could happen does happen, which disaster preparedness in like disaster preparedness world, that's kind of like how they roll. That's their thing. Certainly they do have some disasters that they can kind of predict and plan for, like forest fires. That's a fairly annual thing. And like there's a lot of process and procedure behind that. But I think anybody in the disaster preparedness world is also trying to plan for things that are unexpected. Like, you know, a giant plane tries to land and crashes at a small rural airport. Like that pretty much never happens, but just planning for it has some positive consequences, some positive learnings that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then of course, risk management. Like it always comes down to risk management at the end of the day and trying to spend your time and resources wisely to prepare for the bad things and maybe take a few extra steps, not, you know, you don't need to go crazy, but take a few extra steps for the just in case. Okay, next slide, please. So the black swan, I think, especially now, especially after COVID, like, and during COVID, we kind of have an understanding, colloquial understanding of what a black swan is, the thing, the impossible made possible, a global pandemic that has downstream consequences. Things that I've lived through are, as we all know, September 11th, terrorists hijacked passenger airplanes and crashed them into buildings. Nobody was really thinking that. Like nobody thought that that was a thing. and then it happened, and then like it was a big deal, and it changed our way of life. A global pandemic shuts down the economy for 2 weeks, and then it has these years-long downstream consequences and ripple effects, including, or like not necessarily related, but exacerbating the problem, massive fire at a leading computer chip manufacturer, or entire cloud regions go offline. So again, these are things that are difficult to predict and difficult to think about in complex systems, but when they do, and especially in complex systems, have these ripple effects that we don't always think about, or maybe we don't even know that the things are connected. I was not aware that there was one manufacturer, like one primary manufacturer making computer chips, and that a fire there would mean that cars are more expensive to purchase or even find. Okay, so my thoughts on this are that tabletop exercises could use more creativity. I think in my experience, what I've seen is tabletop exercises often go down the path of the things that are expected, the things that we kind of get into a rut and prepare and plan for. Things like, has an attacker stolen our files? Have they crypto locked our server? Have they, I don't know, hacked all of Sony and stolen all the credentials, and now we have to go buy everything new? I think the tabletop exercises could include things that that are higher consequence. So what is a worst case scenario that would require you to think outside of kind of the normal routine? And then what are the downstream consequences of that impossible made possible? If that impossible thing happened, just even in your own tabletop kind of exercise, what can you think of that might be a downstream effect of that? Next slide, please. Mike, I think this is you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I've done a lot of disaster planning, and one of the ruts people get into, I think, is very much along the lines of what you were saying, where it kind of the scenarios they want to propose are scenarios that are about a specific thing that happened, not the broader case of failure mode. So if you try to stay away from, hey, malware hit our desktops, yes, that's a useful tabletop exercise. I'm not saying don't do that. What you and I are trying to get to is you also need to exercise failure modes where you don't know how it could happen. In disaster planning, often that is, we can no longer access downtown Seattle or Denver or whatever. It is a no-go zone for whatever reason. It's never happened in my lifetime for Seattle, but it's a useful scenario. It could happen. Bad things do happen. So you stay away from the specifics and get more to, here's the part of what we use that's failing and or exposed or in some way unfixable, and walking down those paths as you try to understand and try to react in some useful way. So, if it's about your website, if it's about your e-commerce site, just assume that you have to shut it down, maybe for a week. You can imagine if you're at a major retailer, online retailer, and you say in a proposed scenario, we're going to have to shut down our source of income for a week. There's going to be a bit of crying and gnashing of teeth, but that is exactly the kind of scenario that we are talking about walking through. You won't be able to fix the thing necessarily, especially in the short term, but you should be resilient. You should be having a tabletop that shows that you can in fact do that, and what the effect would be on the organization, and tries to, from that tabletop, derive ways of making it not as bad. When I used to do this as an exercise with consulting customers, I would actually start proposing scenarios and just watching their faces across the table, back when you could see their faces across the table. And the moment I hit on one that made everybody actually cringe, like not fake cringe, but oh, that'd be a moment when I'd start printing my resume if I still had access to a printer. That's the one I'd go for. So that's kind of what we're asking people to think about in terms of creativity in this case. Yeah, and just crazy stuff like the internet isn't available anymore. Our files aren't available anymore. That's happening to people daily right now. But imagine that one of the major manufacturers of internet hardware, Cisco, has a remote code exploit, and everybody's taking all of their routers offline. It's not a comfortable scenario, and there's no way for you to fix that problem globally. But you do need to think about what might happen if you came across that, if it happened to you and the rest of the world. Next slide, please. So you're not going to be able to predict everything. The universe is big, and everything happens. One of my favorite statistics is that an American nickel, which has a nice flat edge on it, if you flip it about 6,000 times, according to most mathematical models, it'll land on its edge once in 6,000 times. That's not what anybody bet on. And the other thing to keep in mind is the volume at which computer events occur. The number of transactions happening while we're doing this webinar is a staggering number. As I was typing the slide, I just took a quick calc and said, for my laptop, about 110 trillion instructions happened on my laptop while I was typing this. That's at the micro level. At the macro level, though, e-commerce events are happening at the probably several 100,000 per second rate right now. It's a big world. Everything you can imagine will happen, and then you'll discover that's maybe 5% of what actually happened. Next slide, please. And Jeremy, I think this is back to you.
Thanks. So for disaster preparedness, I think one of the first things I want to say is that it does imply doing the fundamentals of cybersecurity. This isn't a replacement for that. We don't plan for a disaster and then not do the basics to plan for the everyday or like the normal occurrences. Another thing that I really wanted to point out is that contrary to kind of myth or belief, is that we don't rise to the occasion. We fall to the level of our training and experience. And having been in high consequence environments and situations, I can attest to this. When life gets extremely stressful, when lives are on the line, in my case, where your head goes is hopefully into like immediate triage and what's next and what do I need to do to address the thing in front of me. And when you have good training, then you know what the next step is. You've practiced it, you've planned it, you have an idea of what to do, and then you begin to do something. And oftentimes doing something is better than standing there and scratching your head, because in a kind of disaster, time is often really important. It's of the essence, as we might say. Everyday competence leads to confidence during an emergency. So just like we don't rise to the occasion, if you are confident or competent with your skills and in your job and in your plans, then you will be confident when the stress level is through the roof. As I mentioned earlier, inventory, like the top 20 cybersecurity controls, those are great. You should do those things. And also recognize that you should have an inventory of your skill sets on staff, and also know where your single points of failure are. And single points of failure include your staff. If you have one a Linux guru and nobody else knows how to maneuver around the command line, and that log4j comes out and half of your vulnerabilities are on Linux, and something happens to your Linux guru, then you're in trouble. And you're going to be looking for some resources to help with that at the wrong time. And not only at the wrong time, but also for something like log4j, you're going to be looking for those same resources that lots of other people are going to be looking for. So in disaster preparedness, there is this kind of imagine the worst case scenario. You know, what happens if a plane crashes into a building? What happens if there's a global pandemic? What happens if there's a major supply chain disruption that disallows us from replacing our hardware or even buying new hardware? What happens if there are foundational components of our business that are no longer usable? If you're an online store and your entire storefront or the whole back end for it is vulnerable and you have to take it offline, you're no longer a storefront. So what kind of plans do you have for that? How do you consider mitigating that? And if it's not just you and it's other people, how does that change the game if it's not just you? So one of the things about the tabletops and in this kind of disaster preparedness, the tabletops aren't designed to, you don't win a tabletop exercise. You don't like get to the end of it and think, wow, we did it. We overcame the challenge and fixed it. The tabletop exercise is designed primarily to help you understand where the deficiencies are, where the breakdowns in communication are, what processes or plans could be put in place to respond to these kind of disasters more quickly and more efficiently. And one thing that I like to do, I think we all kind of have a natural tendency to do it, is playing the what if game. And I would encourage you to play that what if game with your peers in the shop and doing these kind of contingency planning. And I also encourage people to think, like, I hate cliches, but thinking outside of the box, thinking outside of the normal, well, you know, if Sam is the Linux guru and Sam is out during this emergency, then we'll hire somebody. That might be like the standard response. We'll contract it out. But maybe you have a friend that's a Linux guru that you can call up. Maybe there's an online forum that you can look at that would help fix those things. So I mentioned this because, like, in my experiences in high consequence environments, in mountaineering and rock climbing and some of these other things, this what if game kind of helps to prepare you for possibilities and how you might respond to those possibilities. So there's a lot of this in self-rescue training and mountaineering, and also in mountain rescue, is identifying your single points of failure, identifying what components are really critical to your safety, but then also playing what if the rope breaks, or what if your partner is sick and you're on the 4th pitch of the east buttress of Mount Whitney? What are you going to do about that? And how are you going to safely get yourself down? So kind of the standard way in that last scenario in a climbing thing might be, well, I'll just do it myself. I'll take the appropriate training and I'll understand how to do this, and like I'll just struggle through it. I think a creative way to think about that is also, well, who are the local search and rescue agencies? Who are the local mountain rescue agencies? Should they be notified that you're in this kind of environment or this situation? And is there something that they can do to help? Are there other climbers around you that can help? And the same kind of like parallels with the IT world. If you're in this really high consequence situation, what other resources outside of the normal do you have that maybe you don't normally think of? And how can you begin to build those relationships or start to collect those ideas before the disaster happens? Next slide, please. So risk management. I hope that there's like a pretty good understanding across group that risk management is kind of key to what it is we're doing here. That first and foremost, risk decisions are ultimately a CEO or board or both decision. That they're the ones who are setting the risk appetite, deciding how much risk the organization wants to take on. That they understand that there has to be risk in order for there to be profit or to be successful, and that they will decide how much risk the organization will take. So our role in cybersecurity is to communicate those risks as well as we can and to mitigate those risks to match the organization's risk appetite. And I say this, and I want to be clear about this because I feel like often it's really common in cybersecurity to want to be the hero, to fix everything, to make it all perfect. And that just leads to like disappointment. So the goal here really is to communicate the risk and mitigate to the organization's risk appetite. And a really important component of managing risk is separating out what could be known and planned for from what could not have been known. I think Mike wants to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I threw this one in, and the very final statement is a little bit counterintuitive, and it has a lot to do with Black Swan events. The nature of a Black Swan event is nobody saw it coming. You know, nobody knew that this could happen until it did. And hindsight always has this particular capability of kind of looking back and saying, oh, of course, all of the signs were there. You know, every financial analyst you've ever seen has been able to predict a crash well after the event. And the struggle here, and the thing I think we want to advise people about is don't, in something like this, like something like Log4j, there's a tendency and kind of almost a driving need to look back and say, well, we totally should have fill in the blank. No, don't do that because you'll drive yourself completely insane. Nobody else in the world did that thing that you just said you should have done. Maybe you should think about it in terms of, well, going forward, we should, try to make our inventory better. No, don't go there. It's perfectly good to do, a 5 whys or something like that, some sort of root cause analysis for normal stuff. Like we got ransomware. Well, ransomware happens every day, and we kind of know how it works, and how it's affected, and maybe we should do better user training and have better endpoint controls. Blah blah blah. That's not a Black Swan event. A Black Swan event is something like, hey, some black box thing over in Azure got triggered by this Log4j thing, and we had no idea that they were using it or we were using it. You can't have known that in advance. So save your time, save your effort. Don't use hindsight in that kind of an event to say, here's what the IT team should have done prior. It's very hard to not do that. But if it truly, if you study the paper, the original works on Black Swan, and I encourage everybody to do that, put links somewhere, Jake, to the published work. If you take a look at that, it does advise you to be careful about that very problem. So non-intuitive, pretty important. Next slide, please.
So the whole idea behind disaster preparedness and this kind of planning is to gain some resiliency, to be able to withstand these kind of uncertain and unknowable events and respond to them in a calm and somewhat planned manner. Having confidence in yourself and your team and your planning will lead to better decision making and outcomes. Again, like I've been in these high consequence environments, and I've seen the difference in real time between what happens with a team that is not high functioning, a team that doesn't have confidence, and I've been on very highly functioning teams, and the differences are striking between a team that's trying to figure out how to respond to the disaster in the situation versus a team that has planned for it and has an idea of what to do. Maybe they don't have all the answers, but they know who they need to rely on. They have confidence in their team, and it works so much better. You get this through continued practice, training, and education. And that's what ensures this kind of competency in these high stress situations. Without that practice and training, then you're just kind of hoping that you'll figure it out in the moment. And that's a bad plan. I mean, as again, like another cliche, failure to plan is planning for failure. So to do this, it doesn't always look like IT planning. Sometimes it looks like, let's learn about tabletops. Let's learn about disaster preparedness and disaster planning. One thing that has kind of influenced me a bit was the ICS, Incident Command System. I'm not suggesting that people use that as their plan, but as a framework or as a model for how to quickly scale a small scale disaster to a large scale disaster and assigning roles and responsibilities, it can work as a really good tool for that. And so practicing that, and it doesn't always have to even be the official people in the roles. If you're doing this kind of training, you don't necessarily need marketing in the public information officer role. You can have somebody else in that role. The objective here is for everybody to learn. What does it take for that role to function properly? What does it take to communicate inter-team, and how do we break these groups up in a way that works for our organization so that we can respond to this? Next slide, please.
And so, I want to get to, some questions for you guys. One of them is that you talked about tabletop exercises there. And, Mike and I actually did a recorded tabletop exercise at one point. One of the problems that I know organizations have with tabletop exercises is not all the right people show up. Who should be there for a tabletop exercise?
Jeremy, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So like I was saying kind of on that last one, I don't think that you need the exact right people. What you need are the roles. I think it would be really interesting to have people who are IT focused be in a non-IT role on that kind of tabletop. They're going to scramble and they're going to be, looking for a lot of answers. They're not going to have all the answers, but that's the point. The point is to learn through the process. What does it take to function in this role? And then you kind of, even if that's not going to be, that wouldn't be your role in the future, understanding what it takes to be in that role is going to help you communicate and interact with that role in the future.
Yeah, next time we want to do this, I want to be CMO because that looks easy to me.
And do you mean chief marketing officer or chief medical officer? Because they both probably look easy to you.
Because what we need more of in marketing or in disasters is more marketing.
Exactly. So I agree with Jeremy here. Of course, the thing I think you have to think about in advance and is really useful in terms of bringing roles into a tabletop is the role of upper management. When we talk about a scenario that's going to be super uncomfortable, like one of my favorites is, and I've mentioned it already, we're going to have to shut our e-commerce site down for a couple of weeks because the consequences of not doing it are, pretty horrifying. The ultimate decision maker who's going to say, yeah, that $2 million an hour that we're making right now, we're going to turn that spigot off. They kind of need to be in that particular scenario. They're not going to like it. They're not going to enjoy their role, and they're central and pivotal to that. That also kind of comes around to this issue. I over the years I've seen a lot, which is On the IT side, it's very common to see people say, when I was teaching this actually, hey, I tried my best to explain this risk to EO, I didn't get it. So I did my best, yay for me. The unfortunate news I gave that person in every case was you failed, because they failed. You have to have really great communications lines already built. You have to be really good at explaining risk in a way that that business leader can use to make intelligent, informed decisions. And that's a part of what I think every tabletop of this nature should exercise, is we're able to tell the people making the decisions everything they need to know in a way that they will understand it, and then have them make good decisions. And if you feel like they're making bad decisions, that's what a tabletop is for. It's like, oh, you know what? We failed to communicate this properly. Let's do better next time.
Yeah, and speaking of the word communicate, we joke, but it is obviously important to have marketing and communications there, because you do have to figure out how to tell your audience, whether it be the public or your buyers, or if you're a B2B company, your customers, what's going on. Speaking of trying to explain what's going on, I know there are a lot of companies that have now faced questions about, okay, Log4j happened. Are you vulnerable? You have access to our system. Are you vulnerable? Mike, in the grand scheme of things and things you've seen in your years doing InfoSec, like, how big is Log4j? I mean, there could be something bigger.
It's as big as it gets for now. There are so many systems that were using the older version of that library, and that code, that I believe in the early days of it, you just had to assume that your suppliers were affected. It was that big. Some of the what ifs that, Jeremy talked about, the importance of doing what ifs during the preparation for this talk. We actually did a little what ifing, and some of the stuff we came up with is worse. So it doesn't take very much to imagine a supply chain issue with respect to components of important infrastructure like a Cisco router, because it's happened. There were issues actually in their supply chain-ish that caused counterfeit components to hit the market. If that had gone to its full kind of fruition, that could have shut down the internet for as long as it took to replace that hardware. That would be bigger.
That's worse. At least we could tell each other what was going on with Log4j, because the internet still existed. So that was good. That's good.
Yeah.
So I want to just tell a little bit about our company. So Critical Insight, sort of two sides to our business. One is on the top, the managed detection response, and on the bottom is strategic program development. But, we really see managed detection response, which is traditionally just SOC as a service, as much broader, where it's the stuff we've been talking about here. It's the incident preparedness. It's the tabletop exercises. We help lead them, response planning. This whole part of the circle over here is stuff we help with. And then obviously we watch networks 24/7. And, this is where we don't want to meet you, which is calling the 800 number and me picking up at 1 a.m. That's not how we want to meet anybody. And then obviously on the bottom, strategic program development is the vulnerability scanning, the penetration testing, which Jeremy pioneered in the company, and that's what we do. And I do want to give folks a way to get in touch with us. You can email any of us. I have the vanity email address, just jake@criticalinsight.com, because I'm in marketing. I'm the vain one. And Jeremy and Mike's email address is there too. Guys, as we leave this up, let's give some folks final thoughts. Jeremy, you first, and then Mike.
Yeah, I think final thoughts are for your tabletops. Again, the objective is not to win them or to solve them. It is to learn where the deficiencies are. I think the tabletops could use a bit more creativity, a bit more like disaster type what ifs. And finally, shoring that up with good training and practice for how you're going to respond to those and what kind of resources you're going to bring to bear to overcome them.
Mike?
Yeah, I think to go full geek here at the end. Your tabletop should look a lot like the Kobayashi Maru for Star Trek fans out there. It was an unwinnable exercise, and Kirk won it by cheating. But you can't cheat this stuff. You do need to exercise things that you won't win, things that will go terribly for you and the company, because that's the way the world is constructed. Jeremy said it before, I want to repeat, this isn't doom and gloom. This isn't the world is ending and it's all terrible. This is when you get good at doing this, when you get good at preparing yourself for the unexpected and being resilient and knowing who you can rely on, what you can rely on, you get good at recovering from something terrible.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Well, thank you guys. Thanks very much for joining us, everybody. We really appreciate being here. To see all of our webinars, you can go to our YouTube channel, Critical Insight, and obviously our website, criticalinsight.com. And until next time, and hopefully it's not because there's another Log4j or another disaster. Hopefully you learn this, get prepared, and then it's not it's not a heart-stopping moment when something happens, because it'll happen. From Critical Insight, from Mike, and from the great Jeremy. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.